This will be the first of several presentations where we cover Chapter 17. We're going to split this chapter up into at least 3 parts, maybe even 4 or 5, just to make it manageable. This first part, I'm just going to cover an introduction, and then we're going to go through just some of the general features of the entire system, and also behaviors of hormones and their receptors, and just some general topics about the entire chapter. I'm simply going to focus on the main parts of the slide, especially some of the terms I know you guys are going to need to know for the test. First, let's just make sure we understand this one right here. Everything to do with this chapter is all connected with homeostasis, just maintaining a set level for all of the different variables we'll talk about. One of the main one here, and they use it for the first example, is maintaining blood glucose. It's going to be a significant chunk of this chapter. We'll definitely see it in this first talk, and the second, and at least the third. We should now know what a hormone is. It's simply a chemical messenger. Note on target cells. Hormones only work on target cells if they have the specific receptor. We will talk about those, but in very light detail. Next quick topic. We're going to compare the endocrine system with the nervous system. Up here, features in common with the system. First, both systems release chemical substances. This is the fancy word ligand, and all it means is something that's going to bind to a receptor. It's used a lot in pharmacology. Next, of course, you've got to have the right receptor. And of course, we're going to institute some change. What about the differences? I'm going to go to the next slide. It shows it pretty well. Over here we see the nervous system. We know how this works. A neuron sends an axon to the target cells. This is, of course, a synapse. Synapses really limit the spread of the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is absolutely limited to this area. The nervous system really targets the cells very precisely. Also, we can get rid of neurotransmitter really fast. So these effects can start quick and they can end quick. What about the endocrine system? We're simply going to kind of be lazy here. Endocrine cells will produce the ligand and will just dump it usually right into the bloodstream. So the hormone is going to go to every part of the body. Target cells with the receptor will be the only ones getting the signal. But because the hormone is spread all over the place, this signal is not going to start as fast, and also it's going to last a lot longer. Next, what about the functions of the endocrine system? We'll be covering these as we go through each specific hormone, so you guys can read this. Let's go down 2 slides. On the left here, these are going to be our major endocrine glands. These are just glands that are only producing hormones. On the right here, we see other organs that contain endocrine cells. In reality, just about every type of tissue or organ does contain some endocrine cells. Real quick, the top one here is the hypothalamus. This is going to be the major control of all of the hormones. This guy is directly hooked into pretty much our major endocrine gland altogether, the pituitary gland. We'll talk about the pineal very quickly. The thyroid we will spend some time with. On the sides of the thyroid, of course, we have the parathyroid glands. A little note about nomenclature. Sometimes it's really easy. Which hormone do the parathyroid glands produce? Well, they produce the parathyroid hormone. If you want to know what that does, go back and review the bone chapter. Moving on down, we have the adrenal glands. We've done half of those. Remember, we've done the adrenal medulla. That's going to be hooked up to your sympathetic nervous system, releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. The adrenal cortex is something altogether different, and we'll take care of that when we get to it. All of these other organs, tissues that contain endocrine cells, we'll go through those as we go through the chapter. Next, a quick rundown of what kind of events will actually induce hormones to be released. And we have 3 different pathways. The first one here is going to be under hormonal stimulation. This one's quite easy to imagine. All we're talking about is some hormones are simply told to be released by another hormone. And usually the naming is relatively easy. For example, Our thyroid gland releases thyroid hormone, or thyroxine. But what controls the release of this hormone? We simply have to go back to one of the major control glands, and this is the pituitary. This guy releases TSH. This is an easy one, thyroid stimulating hormone. Who tells the anterior pituitary to release that? Well, there's actually another one all the way up here. However, just understand for now, hormonal stimulation means that the hormone is released influenced by another hormone. Next we have humoral stimulation. Humor, remember, is fluid. We saw those vitreous and aqueous humors in the eye. This type of hormone release is controlled simply by the level of nutrient or ion in the blood, typically. This is the classic example, and it's really one of the most important hormone interactions we're going to talk about. Blood glucose levels in the blood have to be controlled very tightly. If they go too high, bad things happen. If they go too low, really bad things happen. The important hormone here is insulin. It's released from the pancreas. Pancreas does double duty. It releases digestive hormones, but it also has a major endocrine function. Remember, the point here is we're going to release this hormone in response to a changing level of nutrients. When glucose levels go high, for example, right after a meal, you have to tell the rest of the tissues that they are allowed to store glucose. The pancreas responds to this by releasing insulin. Insulin simply goes to every single organ saying, please store glucose. We've got lots to go around. This is coming under the heading of humoral stimulation. The last one is nervous stimulation, and this is where a gland is directly stimulated by the nervous system. We've already seen the classic example here. We go back to the adrenal gland right there. We have, of course, here, remind ourselves, this is going to be the sympathetic nervous system. We exit here, of course, this is a preganglionic neuron. We bypass any synapse here in the sympathetic trunk. We go all the way to the adrenal medulla. We pretend the adrenal medulla is a postganglionic axon, and this guy releases epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the bloodstream. We also do need to know a little bit about the general categories of hormone types, but we can do this pretty quickly. One group is called the steroid hormones. These guys are going to be based actually from cholesterol. If you remember from 141, cholesterol is a necessary part of our diet. We don't need much, but we do need a little. This is going to be one of the reasons we need it. We'll see a lot of different steroid hormones as we go on. Notice this, because we're going to come back to it real soon. These guys are lipid soluble. That means they do not dissolve in water. And that's a problem, because when we put these in the blood, they're not particularly soluble. Next we have our protein hormones. These are the most common. These are just going to be small, tiny proteins. Remember, proteins are chains of amino acids. There's some terms down here which I'm not too worried about. Know that these are the most common. And are these guys soluble in water? Yes, they are. Last, we have our biogenic amines. These are actually modified amino acids, and we've got two general ones here. The catecholamines, this is actually going to be, come down here, epinephrine and norepinephrine are a type of catecholamine and a biogenic amine. This last guy here is thyroid hormone, released from the thyroid gland. These guys, the catecholamines, are water soluble. This guy is not. There's this last class here called local hormones. There's a couple of terms here which you do need to know, because you're going to see this throughout the rest of the book. Some hormones are actually released by a cell, turn right around, and affect the cell that made them. This is called autocrine stimulation. Another one is paracrine. This simply means that the cell releases the hormone and it initiates changes right next door. These two here are considered a type of local hormone. I've bolded this, but you don't have to know this one. You're going to see it, though, occasionally. There's a group of local hormones called eicosanoids, and there's a bunch of them. Once again, we've got to kind of go and talk about our immune system. These guys have everything to do with this thing called inflammation. This is a type of non-specific response. This is the kind of response you might get just from a localized damage or a localized bacterial infection. It's released by these cells, the eicosanoids are released, and they will go ahead and inflame just the damaged part. These guys, the eicosanoids, don't last long. They're broken down very quickly. Why? You want to limit the effects of these local hormones to just the parts that's been damaged. Now back to this question of how do you get these hormones around in the blood? Water-soluble hormones, for example the protein hormones, are easy. These guys dissolve in the blood in the aqueous solution and simply travel around. What about the lipid-soluble ones? There's a problem. Since these guys don't dissolve in water, they actually need to be carried around by carrier molecules. These are going to be special water-soluble proteins that can grab onto the hormone and deliver it where it needs to get. I'll give you one example, and I kind of wish I had bolded this term because you see it a lot. There's a very common blood protein called albumin. Does this affect how long these hormones last? Yes, it does. You do have to worry about hormone concentration, and especially how long hormones stay around for. So it is getting important to understand the hormone elimination routes. The one I'm going to mention here and actually emphasize is this. Liver cells, one of their functions is they degrade a lot of chemicals in the blood. One of the problems is we don't have a chapter that just deals with the liver. We're going to come across this guy a lot. It is by far the largest gland-type tissue in the body. We see it here the first time, and I know for a fact nursing schools love to ask you guys about the liver. So one of the things the liver does, it helps to degrade excess hormones so they don't last too long. The other thing I'd like you to know is this term down here. How long does a hormone last? You simply measure it by what's called a half-life, which is simply the time necessary to reduce the concentration of your starting amount by half. Some hormones will last a long time. Here's an example. Testosterone can last for days and days. Some of those small little protein ones, though, only last for a few minutes. There's one we'll come across that only lasts for a few seconds. Next, let's talk about how the hormones interact with their targets. Again, this is going to depend on whether they're lipid-soluble or water-soluble. If we remember back in chapter 3 or 4, we talked about how plasma membranes are made out of phospholipid molecules. These guys form bilayers which effectively block anything water-soluble from getting through. Lipid-soluble hormones, however, can easily squeeze through these membranes. So it turns out the receptors for lipid-soluble hormones are actually going to be in the cytoplasm. Here they can form a complex, which just means they're stuck together, and these receptor hormone complexes can just simply go and affect the actual function of DNA. Next, how about water-soluble hormones? Because they're water-soluble, they simply cannot get across that plasma membrane. So the receptor for these guys has to be on the cell surface. There's a lot of detail in this little section, which I left up. It's a great read, but this is really all you have to understand. If you see here, this is the receptor for a water-soluble hormone. It is right on the plasma membrane. Very simply, the hormone binds, this receptor gets activated and simply tells something inside of the cell to change something. There's two terms here. The hormone is considered to be a first messenger. But since it cannot get into the cell, it transfers the signal to what's called a second messenger system. You might see this in some of the chapters from now on, but don't worry about it. I'm not going to test you on it. Just so you know that G proteins here are a very important second messenger. Also the one down here, cyclic AMP. But for this test, just know the difference between how the water-soluble and the plasma and the lipid-soluble hormone work. And very quickly, just so we cover this section, you should realize that receptor numbers can actually change. If you get more, you go through upregulation. Less receptors, downregulation. This actually happens quite often. You can see from this slide there's many things that can cause receptor number changes. Absolutely, how old you are, whether you're a toddler, whether you're in puberty, or whether you're older. The cell state of activity. This even can happen by the time of day, and also what's going on in the cell cycle, whether the cell is dividing or not. In the last section of this part, do note that some hormones can actually interact with each other. There's three types of interactions. Synergistic means that the hormone reinforces activity of another one. Permissive simply means that for one hormone to work, there's actually a second one required. You'll see one example here. Oxytocin actually is milk ejection. Prolactin, though, produces breast milk. Also, we'll see some examples of antagonistic interactions, and this is where two hormones simply have opposing effects. The classic example is going to be these two down here, glucagon and insulin. Insulin is released after a meal. That tells the system, please store the excess glucose. What about between meals when we're running low on glucose? Glucagon, also released from the pancreas, tells us tissues to release glucose.